2,000 years later, 6.5 hours later, a few inches later, day 2, day 3, day 4, a few moments later, 1 eternity later, 3 days later, 12 seconds later, 3:28 a.m., 3 weeks later, many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure, eventually, 12 o'clock midnight, 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later.
Can you move along while that time comes?
Meanwhile, 8:01 p.m. the next day, later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later that same evening, several days later, 6 months later, 2 hours later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 1 minute, 37 seconds later, 1 debt to society later, 1 pair of pants later, 8 hours later, 298 frozen patties later, 3 hours later, epilogue the next day. Meanwhile, at the CrossFit Rack 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later, 3 days later, opening night later, 3,000 years later, 1 week later, 7:59 a.m., 3 weeks later, 3 days later, 2 hours later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later, the following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, 7 hours later, epilogue, several something hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of years later, 16 calendar days later, 2 hours later, much later, yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 minute later, the following day, meanwhile, later, just then, what follows is a brief construction montage. I hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowlands, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, in the void, approximately 10 hours later, early the next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later, 72 hours later, 2 hours later, just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage, the next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, end of flashback, the very next evening, 1 hour later, the next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later, the next morning, moments later, more moments later, 1 semester later, graduation day.
1 hour later.
5 minutes later, 80,000 impressions later. Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-woos later. Soon after, moments later, the next morning, many unbearable hours later. 82 kilometers later, a little later, 3 hours later, 1 season later, many secret parties later, moments later, 1 nap later, 1 very long digestive tract later, 6 months later, 1 pathetic soul story later, many minutes later, 3 hours later, the next morning, 1 shift later, the next day, the next morning, later, the next morning, later that night, the next day, 1 weekend of temporary later, 1 hour later, late again, you get graduate, 5,000 celebrities later. Meanwhile, 1 little crystal sauce later, a few minutes later, 1 hour later, 5 million years later.